This time on Classic Motorcycle A to Z, it's the letter D. So I'm going to be spending the next couple of months on a major adventure. This doesn't mean we're going to leave you without content though. We're putting together a series of videos which we're calling Classic Motorcycle A to Z. So basically we're going to run through the alphabet and give some history and information about various classic motorcycle companies as we go. The Dot Motorcycle Company was established by Harry Reid in Salford near Manchester in 1903. By 1906 they had built their first motorcycle powered by a Peugeot engine. And from the beginning the company built a reputation for competition, with Harry Reid himself taking part in the very first races at Brooklands in 1907. During the Great Depression the company would decide to concentrate its efforts on its bicycles and would cease motorcycle production all the way until 1949. In the early post-war era, the company would produce a delivery vehicle which would be profitable, so much so that they were able to re-enter the motorcycle market. But given the company's history, they were soon back producing competition models, and machines such as the Demon Scrambler would remain popular, and the company would survive the collapse of the British industry by manufacturing parts for their classic scramblers, and recently the name has returned to the road market, producing a range of machines powered by Chinese engines. Douglas Motorcycles was established in Bristol in 1907. Initially the main business was that of foundry work, and they would produce some castings for one Joseph Barter. Barter had produced a machine called the Fee, later called the Fairy, which made use of a flat twin engine with cylinders mounted fore and aft. And when the Fairy company went into liquidation, Douglas acquired the machine tools and jigs and began to produce the machines in their own name. And the company would develop the Fairy into a much more potent machine, enlarging the engine from 200cc to 350cc, a capacity that would be very much synonymous with the Douglas company. During the Great War, Douglas's simple and robust Boxer would find favour with the British Army, who would purchase some 70,000 of the machines. In the interwar years, the company would continue to develop its twin with its fore and aft cylinders. However, the side valve Endeavour of 1934 would be more familiar to those BMW owners out there. When the company returned to production in the post-war years, it did so with a very different machine yet again. This was now a Boxer in the BMW style and with overhead valves, and was still at 350cc, but the shaft drive of the Endeavour was now replaced by a chain drive. There was no front and rear suspension, but used somewhat unusually torsion bars. And this new machine would be developed into a series of competition machines, including the very potent T90 Racer. But these new machines would prove complex to manufacture and somewhat unreliable, especially the competition T90 and T85 models. Consequently, the machines did not sell well at all, and this would put Douglas into financial troubles, not for the first time in the company's history it must be noted. But the small company would survive yet again, and this time they would come back with a more developed version of the machine that was somewhat less ambitious, and this would be the Dragonfly, their last hurrah. The machine used Earl front forks and conventional swinging arm suspension units, and the twin carbs of the sporty models were now replaced by a single carburettor that was, it must be said, some distance away from the cylinder heads, which would, I think, make cold starting rather interesting. And while the Dragonfly was an improvement from the early machines, the company was still running at a loss. And so in 1957 the company was bought out by Westinghouse. Westinghouse had no interest in motorcycle manufacture and would end production of Douglas motorcycles for good. Time for an honourable mention for the company DMW, that's Dawson Motors Wolverhampton, a small firm who produced a range of on and off-road machines throughout the 1950s and 60s. The company began by producing grass trap machines in the late 30s and would run all the way to the 1970s producing off-road and competition machines. Ducati is today one of the most famous motorcycle manufacturing companies on the planet, but in fact originally they were better known for producing radios. But in 1950, almost as a sideline, there began to be used a small bolt-on engine which could be used on bicycles, and this would lead on to full motorcycle production in the 1950s, including scooters somewhat interestingly. But the company became best known for its sporting single-cylinder machines, usually of smaller capacity, around 175cc, but these would gradually be increased over the years to encompass 350 and eventually 450, and it is these small singles that would form the basis for their first V-twins in the 1970s. Like Norton and Velocep before them, Ducati would make use of a bevel drive to their single overhead camshaft, although unlike the British companies, they would make use of desmodronic valve gear. This essentially used a lever to open and actively close the valves, rather than using a return spring as on a more conventional engine. This would allow the engine to rev higher, at least in competition form, but would also mean that you could use a much lighter spring on the valves, producing an engine which was simply more efficient. The first sporting V-twins to use the system were the SS 900 and 750s, and these machines would go some way to keep the company afloat in the mid to late 70s. But that's not to say the company sold them in great numbers. Ducati was a much smaller company then than it is today, being substantially smaller than Motor Guzzi for example. As the 70s wore on, the V-twin range would expand, encompassing the 860 GT Tourist model and the Damar, a machine named after a tiger in a children's book. And there would even be an S model of the Damar, as shown here. This machine was not a great seller and is a very rare sight today. But the period would also see what is for me one of their most distinguished models, their Halewood replica, a machine designed to celebrate the TT victory of the late great Mike Halewood. And this was an extreme machine, and unlike most of its competitors, didn't even feature an electric leg. The late 70s would also see the introduction of what would be the future of Ducati. After a failed parallel twin experiment, the company would produce a belt-driven Ducati V-twin, the Panther 500, and this Grand Prix inspired machine would become the basis for all future Ducatis. The machine replaced those complicated bevel drives with simple belt drive to the camshafts, thus making the engine much simpler and indeed cheaper to manufacture. And indeed the arrival of the Panther would see the beginning of the end for the bevel driven V-twins. The little Panther was soon expanded out to 650cc, giving the bike much better performance, and Ducati would use the machine to compete in the F2 series with a special chassis during the 1970s and early 80s, and indeed this race special would form the basis of the road-going 750 F1, and the F1 would later be replaced by a new SS series, which would see the basic Panther engine enlarged out to 900cc, and then for competition use would come the water-cooled 4-valve 851, which would also feature an all-new trellis frame. And this race-developed trellis frame would form the basis for an all-new machine which would change Ducati for good, because the arrival of the Monster would see Ducati's sales reach previously unimagined heights. And indeed the tremendous commercial success of the Monster would allow the company to produce ever more ambitious sporting models, including the 916 family and the later Panigale and Panigale V4s. Hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. Look out, there will be more videos in the series coming soon. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.